Welcome to Tour with Lisa. Today's virtual tour is of Arlington Cemetery. Now I'm going to break Arlington into two separate videos because there is a lot to talk about. In this first video, we're going to cover the history of Arlington and how it came to be. And in the second video, we'll cover things such as the changing of the guard and the tombs and things that are happening there today. Now we're going to go all the way back in history to George and Martha Washington. So when George married Martha Washington, she was a widow with 2 children, and she had already lost 2 children. But George helps her raise her 2 children. Their names were Jackie and Patsy. Now Patsy passes away as a young teenager, and they think that it could have been epilepsy. Jackie went on to the Revolutionary War. He was married, he had 4 children, and he died at Yorktown. He died of a disease and not of wounds inflicted in battle. So Jackie now has a widow with 4 children. And for some reason, George and Martha end up raising the 2 of their younger grandchildren. We don't know the reason why. It could be that it was too overwhelming for her daughter-in-law to take care of 4 children, or it could be because Martha was so heartbroken after losing all of her children that her daughter-in-law felt sorry for her. But for whatever reason, they raised the 2 younger grandchildren. And we know the relationship between her daughter-in-law and the other grandchildren was very good because they were at Mount Vernon quite frequently. So the 2 children that grandchildren that George and Martha are going to raise are, their names are Washie and Nellie. And Washie is a nickname for George Washington Parke Custis. And that's where the Arlington House story begins. So George Washington Parke Custis had inherited from his father this land, and he decides he wants to build sort of a shrine to his grandfather, George Washington, step-grandfather, because he loved and adored him so much. So he also collects as much memorabilia from the estate as possible. After the Washingtons died, there was an estate sale, but through the years, I think he acquired more and more of the Washington items. So he builds this beautiful house on a hill, and it's called Arlington, and it directly looks over the federal city. So if you're in Washington, D.C., you're most likely to see this big house across the Potomac River on a hill, and that is Arlington House. So now we'll talk about how Arlington actually became a cemetery. So the Civil War is going to break out. Lincoln's going to go to Robert E. Lee and ask him to head up the Union forces. But Lee declines and offers his services to the Confederacy. So he is going to be loyal to his state and not his country, which in turn it angers his comrades. He went to West Point, and the people that he served with were very disappointed and upset with him for doing this. So once he gets down there, he realizes that his family is probably not going to be very safe if they stay at Arlington House. So he sends for them to come down to Richmond, where he is. Now, as the war is happening all around, especially all around, Washington, D.C. area, there are people dying left and right. There's no place to bury these soldiers. All the cemeteries are full. So they're going to need a place to bury them. And because General Meigs was so upset with his good friend, Robert E. Lee, for being a traitor to his country, he decides he wants a little bit of revenge. And he is tasked with trying to find a new cemetery space for the soldiers that, we have no room to bury. And of course, you got to remember at that time, people could not afford to send for their loved ones to bring them back home to bury them. So he decides, because they've already set up camp. They've set up camp at Arlington House because it is a perfect location. It's on a hill. It overlooks everything, so they have a very good vantage point. Well, he decides that maybe we could bury some bodies here, and maybe we could bury him in Mrs. Lee's rose garden. So that does eventually happen. But how does the government get a hold of this property, and how does it become a legal cemetery? Well, because the Lees weren't able to pay taxes, actually it was because Mrs. Lee couldn't pay taxes on the property because the property was actually her property. She had to be the person present to pay the taxes. She tried sending a cousin and that didn't work out. And so the property went into default for $92 in taxes owed. Now, once the property goes into default, it's going to go up for auction. And when it goes up for an auction, there's going to be somebody bid on it. Well, there was one bidder. The sole bid was from the U.S. government. So they acquired Arlington Estate. And that is how the bodies began to become buried at Arlington House. But years later, Robert E. Lee's son decides that, this property was taken to us in, kind of unscrupulous way. So he files a suit against the U.S. government for taking the property. And it does go to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court does kind of realize that, yes, it was pretty underhanded and sneaky. So they're going to grant him a win. But of course, he doesn't want the property back. So he ends up getting, I believe it was around $200,000 for the property. And of course, Mrs. Lee did come back once during her lifetime to see it, but she was so distraught about it that she couldn't even get out of the carriage. So today, the house you can visit. It's ran by the National Park Service, and it has just underwent a very big restoration. But it's really great to go through the house to see what a house was like during that time. You also have an amazing view of Washington, D.C. from the house. You can see the Capitol, you can see the White House, you can see Lincoln, and I might want to point out that there's a bridge directly from the Lincoln Memorial to Arlington House or to Arlington Cemetery. It's called Memorial Bridge. And you might want to say that that bridge is trying to connect the North and the South, so symbolically. Now that is the history of how Arlington became a cemetery. And the next video will discuss a little more about Arlington. Thanks for watching Tour with Lisa.